Hi, good evening, everybody. Let me start now by welcome you all this evening to a lecture on Queens by Larry Samuel, Lawrence R. Samuel, who is today in Miami, but splits his time between the South and the North, and that is, well, not really Northern Manhattan, but Tudor City, the subject of another book that he spoke about at the Skyscraper Museum, so tall buildings, but this one, New York based on the borough of Queens, is a more expansive study than that enclave of the East Side and Tudor City. But it's typical of the work of Larry Samuel, who is a independent scholar, but a PhD in American Studies, and his interests are wide-ranging. But as he explains in this book, they're rooted in New York and some boyhood experiences of yet another subject of his scholarship, and that was a study of the 1964 World's Fair in Queens that he attended as a young boy. So he has broadened out his interest to Long Island and the history of suburbanization there, but he embraced this topic, as he'll explain, of the borough of Queens and its development, its kind of real estate development that turns into, in the subtitle of his book, the most diverse place on earth. And so he's going to describe to us all the shape of the book and some of the subject matter for about half an hour. And then he'll be joined by Lynne Sagalyn, who is a historian of cities and of real estate. So on a kind of similar mindset in the approach to thinking about the historical development of Queens. And many of you know her from her books on planning in New York, especially Power at Ground Zero, and on two books on Times Square. So her focus through her years in scholarship at, well, most recently at Columbia at the business school, and from which she has recently retired, where she taught real estate development, has been a long career of looking at the dynamics of urban growth. And so Lynne and Larry will engage in conversation after I get off the screen. But one thing I wanted to do, because we're seem to be now in a kind of year of Queens, is to put this book in the context of yet another study with a very similar take on the contemporary development of Queens. And that's a book that came out last year called Global Queens by the urban historian Joseph Heathcott. Subtitled Urban Mosaic. And the mosaic part of it that you can see in the photographs here, and I'm just going to show you really quickly in order to whet your appetite because of the colors and the photography, which evoke the neighborhood of Queens. And this is a kind of photographic essay that Joe put together. We invited Joe to be with us tonight, but he teaches at the New School and he had academic obligations for exactly this moment. So I thought we would give his book a plug and also use those images in order to add a little bit of color photography to some of the slides that Larry is going to show in his talk.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. Quite an honor. Um, let's say first, full disclosure, I didn't grow up in Queens. I grew up right near Queens in the Five Towns in Nassau County. But I went to Queens, as Carol mentioned, when I was 8 years old. I went to the New York World's Fair, and as I explained in a book I wrote about it, it really left an indelible imprint on me in these sort of pre-internet days to be exposed to all these times and places. So I felt like this book, in a way, was sort of paying that debt down because I owe something to Queens. And I felt there really wasn't a book that approached the borough, the history of the borough in the way that I would. There's a lot of one-offs, about particular neighborhoods, and they're great. They're mostly photographic. But I kind of wanted to go at it a different way, a fuller way, and see it through the lens of real estate. So that was basically the backdrop for the writing of this book. So just briefly, I just wanted to show you the outline of the book. I have an introduction. I have 5 chapters broken up chronologically. I start with between the World War II years, and then get into the World War II and post-war years, and then get into the late 60s and 70s. And then we have the last 2 decades of the 20th century. And then I bring it right up to today. Okay, so that is just the general outline. So the real purpose, again, is to chart the residential development of the borough of Queens from the 20s today. So it's about a century of history. I've come to the conclusion after writing a few books about real estate, I think the best way to understand a place is to look at the people who live there. And then you have to get into real estate principles and the idea of property. With many books, I found, even after writing the book, I'm like, okay, what is the hook here? What is the big story? There was no doubt with this one. It was really easy because the incredible, profound diversity that evolved over the past century becomes the principal spine of this story. There's no doubt about it. So really, my book is about how Queens transformed what was quasi-suburb, and Queens was considered a suburb at the time, if you go back to newspaper reports, for the white upper middle class to what is considered by many to be the most diverse place in the country and perhaps the world. And I used the 7 train. I talk about the 7 train quite a bit because it's nicknamed the International Express. But I use it sort of as a metaphor for the entire book because it really symbolizes the diversity of the borough in a way, in a physical, tangible way. And you can see the neighborhoods as it crosses through the northern part of the borough. And by the way, I insisted that it be on the cover in some way. My 13-year-old daughter photoshopped the original photograph and stylized it, I think, in a nice way. So don't tell my publisher that, but that's a secret. These are all the groups mentioned in the book. I am not going to go through each one of these. If I've left anybody out, I'm sorry, but just looking at this list, it just comes out right, in front of your face. I think a lot of communities in this country cannot say that they have this many different kinds of people living in their community. I also mentioned many different neighborhoods in the book. And I think one of the strong points is how I sort of cross-indexed those ethnicities with the neighborhoods to show who was living where over time and how that evolved. That is really the thrust of the book. So I let this sort of drive my research, okay? I was interested on a neighborhood-specific way and who lived there and why over time. Now, the world's most diverse place on earth is quite a bold claim. I admit it. It's difficult to definitively quantify, but I think there's enough, not just anecdotal, but hard evidence to support it. We go back to 1990 census data, where it definitively showed that Queens was the most diverse county in the United States based on race and ethnicity, which they did measure in census data. And they specifically, Elmhurst was designated the most diverse community in the country. So there is hard data to back that up. Elmhurst and Jackson Heights and Astoria are sort of going back and forth as who's most diverse, by the way. It's sort of a race over time. Another piece of evidence is we have this DNA testing, this fascinating study done by National Geographic. They had a genographic project. They went into Queens and started taking DNA samples of people in different parts of the borough. And they found Queens, and especially Astoria, to be a, quote, microcosm of the world. There was more DNA from different places than anywhere else on Earth, according to them. So that is another support point I use. And then, of course, we have the Endangered Language Alliance, who said in one of their studies that there were more languages in Queens than anywhere else on the planet. More than 800 actually are spoken. So that's how I sort of back up this very bold claim. We might want to start with cemeteries because at least when I lived in Manhattan, Queens was sort of like either, went to an airport there or you were buried there. So it's a good place to start, beginning with the Rural Cemetery Act in the 19th century. Manhattan and Brooklyn were all full up, so we needed more space for burials, and Queens was a logical place. There was a lot of farmland, there was a lot of open space. There are at least 24 cemeteries in Queens today covering more than 5,000 acres. And here we have Mount Judah on the left and a couple of other cemeteries there, and then just a small section of Calvary Cemetery. My people actually are in Elmhurst, so maybe I will become a resident of Queens one day. Okay, beginning in the early 20th century, we have to keep in mind how rural and bucolic many parts of Queens was. This is really before the development. So here's a postcard, hand tinted, of Rockaway Beach. This could look like a small town in any part of the United States. And that is Bayside as well, this very beautiful pastoral image, and that will rapidly change. And a big part, a big reason it changes is this Queensboro Bridge, which is completed in 1909. It has a huge impact on the development of Queens because now the borough is literally physically linked to Manhattan. It comes at precisely the same time as the rapid rise of the automobile. You can see there's a parade to celebrate it. So this is huge. This is you can't overestimate how important this bridge is in terms of what happens with development. World War I will interrupt the development for a bit, but then it comes right after that. Okay, I just wanted to show a couple of typical houses that are being built in the 1920s. That's Glendale on the left, 1926. And then on the right, we have Astoria in 1930. So these are very representative, very typical of what was being built between the world wars. Here's a couple of maps which I found interesting. The one on the left is from 1924, and they detail all the subway, bus, and trolley lines, as well as the Long Island Railroad, in both Queens and Brooklyn. And you can see already by 1924 how built up the transportation grid was in the borough, which of course is a huge asset for people who want to commute to Manhattan. And on the right is a 1928 map of Ward 1, which is Long Island City, in terms of its voting district. Now, very early on, as far back as the 17th century, the government of that area was breaking down districts into voting districts. And you can see how it's parsed into 39 different districts or zones. Okay, so houses were not the only things going up in Queens in the 1920s. We have this wonderful ad from 1922, sort of bragging about this new tennis stadium that's going to be built, that is being built in Forest Hills. It's going to be the first dedicated tennis stadium in the United States. And there on the right, we have a 1924 image, which was the first year that players played there. That's the women's championship. I was fortunate enough to play there a couple of times. I was on my high school tennis team, and we played some matches there. I actually met Arthur Ashe there, which was thrilling. And I got to hit with a guy named Vitas Gerulaitis, who was a pro. He was a really good player. He was a good friend of John McEnroe. So that was sort of one of the greatest hits of my life, to be able to hit balls with Vitas. Jumping ahead to the late 30s, this is Queensbridge, Queensbridge housing project in I believe Williamsburg is built by the Housing Authority for lower income residents. Now, monthly rent for a 4.5 room apartment, you can see the kitchen there of one of them, was $22.75. Sounds like a pretty good deal. It was huge, this development. There were 29 buildings, each 6 stories, but to save on money, construction costs, they only put elevator stops on every other floor, which is interesting. I think the project is best known for some of the hip hoppers that have come out of it, including Nas and some of the NBA players that grew up there as well. Right across town in 1939, of course, we have the World's Fair. That's the Trilon and Perisphere. And the Ford building on the left. And I love talking to people. When I was doing talks for my World's Fair book, I would meet people who went to this World's Fair, and I would love to talk to them because it was a really beloved fair that people had such fond memories like I did of my World's Fair. Okay, we're into the war years, and Queens was very active. There were many different factories there that produce military equipment or parts. My uncles actually owned one. Their company made jet engine parts. I would go visit them. These are Flushing high school kids doing commando training, which was part of their PE course at the time. And on the right, we have a Forest Hills garden being grown, Victory Garden, with fruits and vegetables, which was encouraged to do. Okay, a couple of other maps. This one on the left is from 1945, and it details not just the streets this time, but the street numbers, which is pretty incredible how detailed this map is, as well as the mass transit options at the time. And on the right is a 1950 map, which shows how much you can really see how much land the cemeteries are taking up. So if you don't see sort of boxes there, that's probably a cemetery. It's a good chunk of the borough. Okay, I'm going to jump up to the early 60s with Idlewild Airport. That is the beautiful Conan Jacobs American Airlines terminal. And then shortly before it was renamed JFK. And then we have Eero Saarinen's beautiful TWA terminal in process under construction in 1961. Okay, we are up to the World's Fair. That is an aerial view from the New York State Tower, for sure, it has to be. We can see Shea Stadium in the background, which was built at the same time, okay? The Unisphere was always intended to be permanent, unlike almost all the other buildings were meant to be torn down, which is typical of World's Fair, but that is still there, thankfully. I walked the grounds about a month ago. The fountain is gone, or at least being repaired. We saw a lot of it at the US Open. If you watch the tennis, it's a great advertisement for the Unisphere. They show it like every 5 minutes, which I appreciate. And I just had to include this. This is my family. That's my dad and myself in the lower middle. We left my little brother at home. And then my mom and the 3 boys of the 4. Now my older brother Artie, I don't know if you can tell him, he's on the left in the left picture, and the second to the left. He looks very unhappy. I think he was not allowed to have a second Belgian waffle, from what I remember. He was very sad about that, but great stuff. There we have the Unisphere again, and we have the New York State Pavilion on the right. Happily, the towers are being repaired now, or at least being attempted. It's a long-term, very expensive project, but I'm happy they were able to salvage those. We saw them in Men in Black, of course, with all the bugs coming out. That is the Undulating Hall of Science, and it is now part of a wonderful museum, the New York Hall of Science Museum for kids. It's awesome. And then the General Motors building, which I find interesting because it's not shaped like a car, which it was in the 39 World's Fair, by the way, but a jet airplane, it being the jet age. And I had to throw these in as well. This is the Travelers Insurance building on the left. Now, it is not a clamshell, as most people thought it was. It's supposed to be an umbrella, which was the corporate logo, but people really did think it was a clamshell. And on the right, we have the wonderful Selectric ball. The Selectric typewriter had come out by IBM, and that is just a gorgeous building. Okay, there we have Shea Stadium. I would go to Shea Stadium as a kid and see the Mets, who were not very good, usually play, but it was an awesome experience. It was replaced, of course, by Citi Field in 2009. Okay, this is a pivot point. So if the 1909 Queensboro Bridge was important, this event, I think, is even more significant in terms of the development of the borough. This is LBJ, of course, President Johnson. He is about to sign an act called the Hart-Celler Act, or what has become known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. That is New York Harbor, very fittingly. And this sort of changes everything in terms of who decides or who can move to Queens, okay? Because Queens had sort of gradually started to diversify in the late 40s. There are some people from the Caribbean coming, some people from China in the late 50s, some Japanese came over, but for the most part, it was home to Irish Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, some African Americans. There were thriving African American communities in Jamaica and Corona, as well as some Jewish Americans. But this overturned the 1924 Act, the National Origins Act, which favored people in terms of immigration from Western Europe. This opened it up to Asia and Africa and other parts of Europe. Okay, so this is a huge event that I think foretold what was going to happen through the late 60s into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And here you can see sort of evidence of that. On the left is an image of Flushing from 1970, and on the right, a more contemporary shot of the same area. And that is one of the Garden City developments in the 1920s in Jackson Heights. There were others in Forest Hills Gardens and Sunnyside Gardens. Now, these were targeted specifically to the managerial class in Manhattan, which was growing. Some were having families. They wanted to get out of the city. They wanted bigger apartments. They wanted greener spaces, but they also wanted a short commute. So these were just wonderful for them. Unfortunately, they were, quote, restricted, which means that African Americans were not allowed in because of the covenants, nor Jews, nor Catholics. So that is a sad legacy of this part of Queens. Here you see the new Jackson Heights, so you can see the changes in that neighborhood as well. Here are a few classic row houses in Elmhurst, which look very much like the houses at the opening sequence in All in the Family. The opening sequence actually was shot on Cooper Avenue in Glendale for trivia folks, if you want to know that, but they look just like the ones in All in the Family. And on the right, you see contemporary Elmhurst, specifically the Chinatown of Elmhurst, which is basically an extension of the Flushing Chinatown. I don't think Archie Bunker would be too happy with what became of Elmhurst. Okay. Now, another pivot point is space running out in Queens. So how does Queens develop in other parts of the country? Well, they develop vertically, of course. And there's a good story to tell. You could arguably say that actually Queens has a better view because you're looking at Manhattan. And so agents and brokers are selling that. And again, the super tall construction that is going on near the East River in Queens is part of not just a national phenomenon, but a global urban phenomenon. So Queens is hardly alone in this. But legitimate questions are being raised. This is a good thing, and specifically for Queens. Supporters argue, well, you need people, you need more people if the economy is going to grow. And if vertical is the only way it can grow, well, that's good enough for me. While critics have a bunch of complaints, they say these huge buildings are compromising the livability, sustainability. They are just not to human scale. They don't fit in with older neighborhoods' character. They block light and view. They're economically divisive because almost always these new buildings are luxury housing for people of means. And then other people just say these buildings are ugly aesthetically. I don't like them. Okay, and here we can see what was tall, considered tall in 1928. The Bank of Manhattan Company built this huge skyscraper at the time. It was a big deal. It was 14 stories. You could even buy a picture postcard of the building because it was so impressive. But now here we have much taller buildings. This is the number one, the Orchard on the left in Long Island City, which is 69 stories. Which is 5 times as tall as that Bank of Manhattan building. On the right, we have Skyline Tower, which was completed in 2021 and comes in at 67 stories. This is the Sven in Astoria, where this is also happening, at 64 stories, and the Lumen in Long Island City at 66 stories. Now, One Court Square goes all the way back to 1990, but it was considered huge at the time. It was 50 stories. It still is 50 stories. And here we have Tower 28, which comes in at number 6 in Long Island City at 57 stories. Okay, I think the best way to wrap up is with this image of the Valley of Ashes, the famous Valley of Ashes in Fitzgerald's 1925, The Great Gatsby. That's an image of it, an ash heap, which Robert Moses despised and wanted to get rid of through 2 World's Fairs. That's another story. And here is what is planned for that precise spot. Here we have the FIFA, the soccer stadium, which Queens people are very excited about to have soccer there. Here in Miami, we're getting it too. So people are very excited about that. But there's going to be senior housing. There's going to be a public school. There's going to be a hotel. There's going to be open space. So I think this transformation is a good way to really illustrate the incredible development of the borough over the past century. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I'm going to invite Lynne to turn her camera on. Lynne, I introduced you a bit as a historian of real estate and of cities. I didn't mention, did I, that you were raised, you spent some of your childhood in Queens in Kew Gardens. So from a perspective of a native and the distance of a historian, Lynne, take it away and your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Larry, for such an informative presentation and a really nice book. As Carol mentioned, I was born in Queens. I was born in Flushing, but my family's association with Queens goes back to my great-grandparents who had a dairy farm in Maspeth, where my father was born. And I'm sure it was before the era when you were allowed to have where you had to have birth certificates. So I'm sure he was born at home on the farm. And that farm is now part of the Long Island Expressway. And my grandparents and great-grandparents are buried in 2 of the cemeteries of the 24 that Larry mentioned. And, you know, it just goes on and on. We have a long association with the borough. And I too, Larry, went to those early Met games. And we had a great time, but you weren't expecting the Mets to win.
No, it was Little League. It was.
Okay. So I have lots of questions, and mostly questions geared to having you explain more of your thoughts of the book, things that are not so easy to bring out in the presentation. So let me start by just saying, as Carol showed briefly that map of the neighborhoods, Queens has has 30 or more neighborhoods. And so you had choices to make about which neighborhoods you wanted to profile. And so could you just give a couple of examples of why you chose, for example, Jamaica or Jackson Heights? Those are 2 well-known ones, or Astoria. I mean, they all have their own stories. And they all have their own diversity, and some will have no diversity, like perhaps Douglaston. And so
Right.
can you talk a little bit about the borough is diverse, but not every neighborhood is diverse?
Yeah, again, a lot of the literature is dedicated to a particular neighborhood. And those are great. I wanted to sort of do something different. I wanted to focus on the people. So I let the groups of people based on their ethnicity or race drive the project and sort of backed into the neighborhoods that way. So I was very interested, okay, where are the Irish? Where are the Italians? Where are the Germans? And how does that change? Because it continually evolves. I mean, just look at Flushing, which was primarily, Jewish and Italian up until the 70s. So there's this revolving door going on, and that's fascinating to me, is who's moving in and who's moving out. The neighborhoods were almost, I'm not going to say incidental because they all have their character of their own, but my emphasis certainly was on the groups, because I felt that illustrated the diversity much more than the actual physical geography.
So,
Yes, go ahead.
so I was going to just pick up on that by saying one of the most interesting stories of your book about people is that the stories about African Americans settling in Queens and one or two developers who built housing for them. I don't think this is a well-known story.
Right.
It certainly is not part of the conventional wisdom. And
Yep.
one of the questions I have for you, well, there are really two. One is sort of how did you come about that story? And the
Mhm.
second is what made a particular set of African Americans settle in Queens as opposed to Harlem, where where the conventional wisdom has that most, without knowing the exact data, settled certainly by the early part of the 20th century, and certainly as part of the Great Migration from the South.
Right. Good question. Yeah, it isn't a story that is very well known, and I wrote a whole other article about it separately because it does deserve more attention. First, with the research, I'm a huge fan of these African American newspapers that are all online now, by the way, through the New York Public Library. They're just this reservoir of information and insight into Black culture that the major newspapers are not covering. So I relied heavily on the New York Amsterdam News and about at least a dozen other ones that were also reporting, believe it or not. Even the Chicago Defender was talking about what was going on in Queens, as was the Los Angeles Sentinel, and also and about 10 or 12 others. They are just fabulous in terms of research, and they would profile particular people. And so I would learn about these real estate men and women. There were some women as well who were in the business sort of independently from the white real estate scene. They occasionally overlapped, but these were people who recognized there was an opportunity, and a lot of white real estate people didn't want to deal with Black clients. And we have to remember that there was quite a lot of prosperity among the African American community in the 1920s. They were part of the boom. They were getting railroad jobs and other jobs that they hadn't had previously. So they had money. So if you had $5,000, you could buy a house. And partly through steering and partly because of the communities themselves, Jamaica, which is named after the Indian tribe, by the way, not the Caribbean island, was prospering, as well as Corona. Those are the two principal communities. And real estate people really did very well in terms of getting renters who were the victims of landlords to buy property. So it was not just to make money. And I got some great quotes in the book, but they sort of wanted to uplift their race, is what they described. Now, some people were coming up from the Great Migration and coming to New York City, and they chose Queens either for the lower cost or because they had family members in Queens. But a lot of people were moving over from Harlem because it was getting way too crowded. It was considered actually sort of dangerous in a way because of the disease, the crowded conditions. So people were getting out for the suburbs, for the fresh air and the green spaces. And the same thing was going on from Brooklyn as well, a little bit less, but a lot of people came from Harlem.
One of the points that you mentioned in the book was that in an unusual instance, Corona was not segregated. The tenor of the time, segregation, it was segregation by design, segregation by covenant. Redlining comes later, but it's sort of after the fact that you had all of the different patterns and ways of enforcing segregation, both formally and informally. What was it about Corona when you talk about it that it was not segregated, at least according by your analysis?
Right. Yeah, most of the neighborhoods were definitely segregated in Queens and continue to be so, up until like the civil rights movement, actually. Corona, it was mostly had to do, there were a lot of churches there, and they were, Black churches. And so I think a lot of people were attracted to that. It was also middle class. Some of the more famous people like Adisley Park as well, some entertainers and some people in the entertainment business, quite famous people, liked Corona. So they went there, like they did with Adisley Park as well. So I think it began with, some folks moving there, and unusually, the white people that were there, it didn't become sort of the blockbusting that we have in most other parts, I think because of the class issue. These were middle class people. And so it was more about class than race.
Right. Could you just, we talked a little before the program started, you mentioned how important the Queensboro Bridge is and the subways. But also, I would ask you two-part question. What was the role of the Long Island Railroad, which comes before? And what did you mean by the transportation reshaped the built environment? I think that rebuilt and fashioned the environment is words that those of us who are urbanists use, but I think it deserves to be unpacked a bit for our audience.
Well, I think with each mode of transportation that develops there, whether it be the automobile, and the bridge carries cars over, and with building of roads like Queens Boulevard, Merrick Parkway, some other roads, it makes it much easier for people to get around, especially to work and especially to Manhattan. So I think with each transportation, whether it be the car and roads, or with the subway stops that are being added in the early part of the 20th century, and with the Long Island Railroad adding more stops, like when they added Kew Gardens, actually, real estate takes off. People come there.
Oh, I know. Yeah. I mean,
just like today, because if you're near a transportation hub, you can get to where you're going much faster. So it has a direct effect on people, not just the managerial class, but the working class as well, who have to get to their job sites as well.
Well, one of the interesting maps that you show in the beginning with the subway, it's really the northeastern part of Queens that has the transportation. If you look at the southern part, at least on the seven doesn't go there, but there are other forms of transportation there. So the development as it occurs by new modes of transportation is uneven. It will start, the development will start where the first mode is, which was the railroad, and then it'll be the bridge, and then it'll be the subway.
Yeah, right. It's a little similar to what happened on Long Island. It's in that the Long Island Railroad, basically ran originally through the center of the island. And Long Island in the beginning, it was either fishermen or wealthy folks with their estates on each shore, because you want to be near the water if you own a yacht or whether you're a fisher person. So when the railroad starts expanding, the Long Island Railroad, through the center of Long Island, adding stops, it really changes the demographics, because now you can have the managerial class getting to and from Manhattan much easier. And so the population shifts and centralizes in the middle of the island than previously, before the railroad really developed and extended all the way to Montauk. A similar thing happens in Queens. It's not as dramatic, but you can really see that on Long Island.
You mentioned the Hart-Celler Act and the 1964 immigration changes. are dramatic for the whole country, but
Yeah.
certainly, especially New York. And it clearly, changes the diversity of Queens. Do you have, my question is, how diverse was Queens before the Hart-Celler Act allowed so many new immigrant groups to come to New York? It was not, I don't imagine it as being homogeneous, but I wonder how diverse it was prior to that act.
Right. It was not very diverse. If you want to consider just Western Europeans as a particular group, again, we had the Irish, Italians, and Germans who I can't give you a percentage, but they were, maybe 3/4 of the population. And then we did have the African American communities in Corona and Jackson Heights, and then Jewish Americans sort of scattered about. But that was it. It really, it was probably more diverse than a lot of communities around the country, but compared to probably some other boroughs, like, Manhattan and the Bronx and Brooklyn, it was less diverse. It was heavily white. It was working class. And yeah, a lot of it just had to do with a lower cost of living. That's why people were there versus the other boroughs.
Uh, one of the most amazing things about the diversity of Queens really is its fluidity, which you talk about in the middle of the book. But fluidity in terms of neighborhood change is a characteristic certainly of New York, but not only New York. It's part of the urban story.
Yeah.
But what do you think makes the fluidity of Queens different? Or maybe it's the same. I mean, but I just think it'd be good for you to give some talk to that.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if it's different, but it's magnified. To me, it's like exponential. And for whatever reason, people from certain countries that are experiencing either political or economic troubles, chances are they knew people in Queens who came over, before earlier immigrant groups. So we have just migration after migration to Queens, again, because of the cost of living. A lot, it just becomes down to money, some of it. If you're going to New York City, it's cheaper to live in Queens than Manhattan for the most part.
Yes, I mean, I know the transition because my aunt and uncle, who I spent a lot of time with, had a house in Flushing,
Right.
and I watched Flushing become Asian.
Right.
And since I love Chinese food and any kind of Asian food, I was always thrilled because, we were probably the only Caucasians in the restaurant
Yeah.
more than once. But the transition it was astounding in Flushing. And China, it's not even Chinatown in Flushing. It is Flushing that is Chinese and Asian.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a pretty spectacular kind of dynamic.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the borough just became a magnet for undocumented in particular, maybe because of
Well,
cost of living.
certainly that was clear during COVID, and
Yeah.
you mentioned a lot about Elmhurst, but Elmhurst had the worst COVID
Yeah.
crisis of any of the neighborhoods in New York City.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
you've talked about all the positive aspects of the diversity and how transitions happen, but it's also, and the Heathcote book, talks about it, it's also a place of incredible tension.
Absolutely.
And in fact, one of there's a Fred Wiseman film on Jackson Heights, which everybody should see. It's just
Right.
incredible. And there is all these tensions. Because not, diversity sounds great until your
Right.
neighbor is driving you crazy
Yeah.
because of cooking or animals or whatever it is. So can you
Right.
talk to the tensions that are characteristic as you understand them in a place as diverse as Queens?
Well, I think when people come, they are bringing their histories from their country, in terms of how they feel about people from other countries. So, when the Dominicans come, they're not coming in a vacuum. They're bringing their memories of how they feel about other groups that are usually their neighbors, and neighbors always hate each other. It's just, it's true. Look, the Mideast.
Oh, you're absolutely right. My husband talks about these small towns in Canada where the people came over and they brought with them all their biases and,
Right.
grudges from the old country.
Yeah.
Like just carried it over with them.
Yeah, so I think that's a big part. They're just bringing the history of their country, and the conflicts and the tension, and they're also competing for jobs. Um, they're being targeted, by the government, the undocumented, and so it's sort of a revolving door of which group is being mistreated the worst. But I think it's just a function of what's going on globally with international relations. And it's just a petri dish when you put that many of that slide that I showed you with, I don't know how many there were, 100 or something together. Some stuff is going to happen. I mean, that's just human nature. That's just the way it works, in any place. It's just a concentration of people in a relatively small space. You're going to have some sparks.
You talk in your introductory comments, you talked about how, and you presented as a history of the development of Queens. Do you think from your perspective of and your work in writing this book, what do you think distinguishes development in Queens as opposed to Bronx or Brooklyn? And we always forget about Staten Island, but Staten Island probably has the development that's closest to what Queens is, although it's not diverse, not like Queens, but it's much more rural the way Queens started out to be.
Right. I'm not sure because I haven't done a deep dive into Brooklyn or the Bronx, but I would say it's the intermingling of different ethnicities all in one place. How many there are in such a small place. So rather than a neighborhood, that is like all Dominican or all Irish, which communities tended to be dominated by a particular group, go to Jackson Heights today. Oh my gosh. And, it's just a mashup.
That's
This,
why I suggested people should see the Fred Wiseman film as
yeah,
a pair to your building, your book, because
right.
um, so let me close with a question to you, which will allow you to sort of sum up a bit. Is what three ideas do you want the audience to take away from your book? The first one is clearly it's a diverse place, a very, very diverse place.
Right.
But going a little deeper than that, what are the things you want people to take away?
Right. Yeah. I think you just have to begin with how many people from different parts of the world are in one borough. That is just the central thread, and people don't realize it. So that's really the beginning of it. I think, secondly, is that I think Queens deserves a lot more respect than it does, than it gets. It's the Rodney Dangerfield of boroughs. It's uh, Manhattan. I lived in Manhattan, and people didn't want to go there. It was like, why would I go? Why would I go there? Why would I, especially why would I date a person in Queens? So I think it's just this simmering pot of life that people don't realize is going on there unless you go there personally. I went out to Flushing and I was just blown away. I was like, this is just such an alive place. So I think Queens just deserves more respect. And I tried to, that was sort of the secondary goal of my book, was just to try to legitimize it instead of being a poor sibling of New York City. And then I think third is just the changing of the borough and what threats that pose to the people that are living there. Is it going to become, luxed up because it's on the river on the east side and, it's both shoreline as well on the north? Is it going to gentrify and change into something that isn't now? I think there's a real risk of that because developers are looking at it and building bigger and bigger buildings. And I think money is to be made. And so I think there's a distinct threat to the character of Queens. And it's just beginning.
I want to thank you both, but maybe before we leave, we'll turn the tables on Lynne and ask how she thinks from her own studies of real estate development, the history of Queens informs the present development. Am I wrong in thinking that the that large tracts of development are a characteristic of the first growth, and then the nature of changes is maybe to break down that more kind of monolithic monocultural development?
I think, Larry focuses in his book on the people um, as a means for explaining development.
Correct.
You're asking a question about the physical development, and the neighborhoods are quite different. And they developed at different times. And there were certain parts that did have, especially after, that, I mean, it was all it was farms. Yes, there were some estates, but it was really farms. I mean, my great grandparents had dairy farms. My father learned to drive when my grandfather said, take the milk to the dairy. And there were Indian medicine men coming every 6 months. I mean, it was really rural. And and so pieces of Queens developed differently. And then when you really had cars, when LaFrac comes and develops LaFrac City, I mean, there was a big piece of land. And I think what Larry presents in terms of the high density in Long Island City today, that's not vacant land. That's a transition from industry to residence. And there was a long period of fallowness where there was nothing there. But that part of Long Island City was an incredible, innovative industrial distribution facility called Deegan Terminals in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. So the physical development of Queens is a companion story to the people development, the people residential movements, but it's not it's I was going to say it's a little more episodic, but it has its phases, and that, of course, is what I'm interested in, is how the city changes through these different phases of development that both attract and repel people.
Good stuff. Yeah, I just wanted about the Long Island Railroad. I just had to mention that farmers love the railroad because they actually use it to take their produce to markets in Manhattan. That was one of the main uses of the railroad. It really wasn't commuters way back in the 19th century. It was it was for agriculture. Just another railroad point.
Well, you've certainly given us a great history from, well, the farming the cemeteries of the population of Manhattan to turn to enlivening the borough with
I keep
multiple
trying to tell
cultures.
you, Carol, that you should go out these cemeteries. Mount Zion Cemetery is just, I mean, it must be 1 square acre. I mean, it's a European
Square
cemetery. It's a
mile.
Jewish
Yeah.
cemetery. It's a European, and I'm sure all the others have their own characteristics. But people don't understand until you see the aerial that Larry showed in one of the pictures of how massive these cemeteries are. And then when they filled up, then everybody went out to Long Island to Farmingdale.
There's
Well,
actually a fascinating study about how different ethnic groups treat the graves differently. Have you read about this? Like Italians supposedly decorated, they put little fences around their loved ones
Well, the
and
Jewish
plant flowers.
the Jewish cemeteries in the early 20th century when Mount Zion was developed, they have Jewish burial societies, and they were a very important part of the culture of Judaism and death. And at Mount Zion, you have a memorial to the Triangle Fire victims. I mean, these are cultural places, just like
Yeah,
the cemeteries in Brooklyn. I mean,
yeah.
and when
They're
during
very rich.
COVID, that's what you do. In COVID, that's where you went because it was outside.
All right.
Yeah. And so thank you, Larry, for bringing to light. I agree with you that Queens is deserving of much more respect than it gets. And hopefully more people, especially the people listening to this presentation, now understand it in greater depth.
And many more books on the subject. There's room for this evolving history. So thank you both for Larry for your presentation and Lynn for your great comments and questions. I think that dialogue really enriched too how much there is to discuss in this material. So thanks all for being here, and see you next time, folks. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.